Hi everyone, welcome to today's podcast. Today I believe is the 7th of October 24 and today I've got with me Dieter, who comes from a HR tech background, I believe.
Yeah.
Dieter, do you want to give us a couple of details on yourself?
Been in the game for a good 20 years, resonate or gravitate towards HR tech recently over the last few years. Thanks for having me along.
Brilliant. Good to have you here. And as always, we'll delve straight in with a good question.
Okay.
And I think today's question is AI overlords. It's a big one on the cards. AI overlords. Is HR the last line of defense for stopping humans in the workplace? Or keeping humans in the workplace is what I mean.
I think it could be. I think it could be. HR tends to be like the ethical side of a business, isn't it? It represents the ethics within a business. To answer your question, it could definitely well be, because let's be honest, it's in everything, isn't it? You know, AI is now a fundamental part of every single thing which we do, in every single operation as well, every single one.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this, and human resources is an industrial era term, right?
Yeah.
And so it comes from the idea of thinking of humans and resources as resources. And yet, if you think about the AI sphere to it and turning that around, then actually, do you think we need to maybe drop that term completely if we're talking about the humanization of the workforce?
No, again, I mean, we've had a very similar conversation around jobs recently and transitioning away from job profiles to make it far more about the individual and their capabilities and their skills and what they bring to the table. And that's very much in that skills conversation. That's part of that skills conversation. And that's very much about humanizing the whole process of taking that resource and allocating it to a output which you want to sort of achieve, and getting that in a way which is ethical. I do think as well, like you see, yes, we've seen things like net zero starting a lot of this sort of drive towards where we ultimately have ESG now, and the social, the S in that is always the harder one to define, but we're seeing a lot more of that kind of starting to creep into all of the different areas of the business. So, and businesses actually being evaluated in terms of their value on the marketplace against metrics which are found within ESG, not just CSR, because ESG is not just CSR. So I think, again, coming back to your original question, yes, I think there needs to be a lot more focus on this, because I think there are few places which are going to be focusing in on it, on the human element, as much as what HR. And HR has got the widest spread in terms of people within a business to influence a lot of those kinds of things. You know? So there's very few functions where you have a individual representing the people within every other function in the business. So its spread is quite big. So its opportunity to influence is quite big as well.
Something I picked up on there, the job profiles. How did you say getting rid of job profiles?
Well, so if you want to move into a skills-based operation, and there's a lot more context to that, but if you want to sort of take advantage of latent talent, which you have, say you individually, you as a person, you go for a job, your job has a profile, it says these are the things that you need to do as part of your job, but it doesn't consider you as an individual and all of the other latent talent that you might have.
Okay.
So a skills-based operation looks at the skills which are required in order to achieve a particular output, or an outcome, shall we say. And what it does, it looks as the individual and all of their skills. And then it sort of makes those skills available to other areas of the business, because your mechanism by which you allocate work to individual is based on skills and their skill profile. So all of a sudden we're taking advantage of a lot more than just the things which are sitting within the job description. You're taking advantage of Chris. And all of his talent. So I think one of the things which, you know, fundamentally in terms of an ethos you have to change is to move away from job profiles and move far closer to personnel, individual
really
capabilities type profile.
So obviously, when it comes to jobs at the moment, we've been looking at whether it's best to recruit people based on the time they work or the goals they're looking to achieve. So is that the reason to move to the skills-based side of things?
I see it very much as a sort of transitional sort of mechanism. So in order to answer that question, I suppose coming back to, I suppose, one of the original questions, which I think you asked and we spoke about when we first met up, was, what does the future of HR look like? That need for presenteeism or how work is evaluated, I think, is fundamentally going to have to be reevaluated. And I think a lot of people are going to have a tough time with that.
Change.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people are going to have a really, really difficult time. So if you correlate time spent with earnings, for instance.
Okay.
So if you do 40 hours of work or 37 hours or 35 or whatever number of hours it is, that equates to X amount in terms of, what you're going to get paid and your reward and recognition. So that fundamentally is going to change.
Yep.
At its core. So how you reward somebody is going to shift from that to value.
Yep, makes sense.
And the reason why is because we talked about AI. AI is going to elevate our roles. And there's a social impact to that, and I think we can come on to that in a bit. But fundamentally, machines are going to be picking the strawberries, planting the potatoes, those kind of things. So that sort of repeated manufacturing, sort of repeated activity, even in terms of HR, that's going to be picked up by machines. So that means you either elevate up or you move out.
Yeah, of course.
If you want to stay in it. All right. So if you're elevating up, then it does sort of mean that actually you don't really know what's happening, and that's a risk there at the bottom because it's all fully automated. And in order to be able to do proper resource management, you need to know what resources are required to go into the bottom bit. So I think the reason I'm saying it's an interesting question is because actually you're going to see a step change in terms of if you're operating strategically and it's far more cerebral, you could work for 2 hours and impact and create the same amount of value as somebody which has worked 40 hours.
Yep.
So therefore, I work 2 hours and I get paid the same as you who's worked 40 hours.
Yep. And absolutely not fair, yeah.
Well, is it? And this is the thing. And this is the question. That's the right question. Like, is it fair? Because it's based on the value that you represent. And again, if you as an individual come to take on certain responsibilities within a company, and you bring 20 years of experience in subject A and 10 years of experience in subject B, you might, based on your task, be doing the same thing as the person sat next to you, but you're getting paid twice as much because you bring all of this wealth of knowledge. So again, the question, which I think we're going to have to get through, is how much value is that individual to you as an organization, both in terms of the experience they bring, but also in terms of their ability to be able to create value in your workplace. So again, I think it's the right question, but fundamentally you move away then from jobs and tasks and hours and presenteeism, and you start to go into a space of value.
Of course. So I always talk in this podcast about 50 years time from now. So I think when I sent you the piece of paper, 2074 was the year we were coming up with. So in 2074, what does a job advertisement look like? Can you give could you give an example of what you think it would look like? That's a cracking
question.
If we
genuinely I don't know. However, there's certain things that we can sort of glean from the trajectory we're on at the moment. Like I said, I think a lot of this is pretext with the fact that all the repeatable tasks are going to be automated. Anything relating to data or information is going to be picked up by machine learning, that kind of stuff. we're going to be in a space where there's hyper personalization of, you know, well-being and personal support. But when I say hyper personalization, that's a really positive spin on things. You also have the other side of it, which somebody could look at that and say, hang on a second, everyone's going to know absolutely everything about me. So that the minute I feel a little bit overwhelmed, I've got something which is pinging at me or saying to me, you're feeling a bit overwhelmed because it's plugged into my pulse, or I don't know. It's those kinds of things. But that hyper personalization and knowledge of you, so you're constantly performing at your optimum, with a view of your well-being constantly being assessed, I think brings a lot of things into question. There's this kind of like this, there's this space where you're going to have to go, okay, right. So if I'm not dealing with data, I'm not dealing with information, I'm dealing with the so what of that information, the insight, and I need to make decisions around direction of the company or direction of my function or responsibilities of individuals around me. You kind of go, okay, how do I do that in a moral and ethical way?
Of course.
So then the whole conversation then shifts, doesn't it? It goes away from whether or not we're talking about jobs or anything like that, because I think those things are going to naturally happen. We're going to evolve into that space. But then it becomes a far more question around where do we want our moral compass to be pointing when we're going into this, so that we don't find ourselves in a space where we have, and apologies, I'm throwing a lot of different ideas at you, but we have social inequality.
Yeah.
So I think that's where you start to get to the real nub of, okay, all of those things can happen, and they can happen tomorrow, the day after, whatever, and it's going to happen. We're going to get to a space where we're going to have access to that information. We're going to have tools and systems which are going to be able to give that hyper personalization.
Yeah. I mean, do you think jobs are going to exist in the future? That's another question that's coming up.
Another really good question, because I you know, eventually we're going to be in a Star Trek where it's not going to be about jobs. It's going to be about purpose, isn't it? Everything's going to be about purpose. You know, so what is your purpose, and where are you adding value? And it could be in how you add value to family members, you know, and that's how you get rewarded, because a lot of the jobs have been picked up by machines and, you know, computer. So I think we a lot of people, I don't think about things in this way, because it's quite scary.
Yeah, a lot of change, as we mentioned. Change is going to be the biggest, probably the biggest thing that's going to hold us back. Actually, it's probably going to be our own ability to change.
And also think about it. If me as an individual, if I evaluate my value based on my ability to deliver or do a job, and that job gets taken away from me, how do I measure my value? Do you know what I mean? So there's that. That's the bit which is really going to be difficult for people to get their head around. You know, like how do I measure my own value? How do I say I am worth X?
And I suppose there's going to be, surely we're going to hit a point at some point in the future where less people need to work. Will we call it work? What do you think?
It's a good question.
Will it be work if that's the case?
I think there's always going to be work to be done. I just don't think that you're necessarily going to have jobs.
There's quite a big distinction between the two, yeah. So
I think there's always going to be work to be done, you know, whether it be, I don't know, doing some gardening and making a nice place which keeps my well-being and my family right. You know, I think there's always work to be done, and that comes back down to purpose, and the distinction and the connection between that and purpose. But whether or not there'll be jobs or not, in the traditional sense, in 50 years' time, and again, I say this because if you go back 5 or 10 years, the idea that we will be having this conversation outside of the realms of potentially maybe a script for a new sci-fi film or something like that. Minority Report number 2 or something like, I don't know, Star Trek episode. And the fact that we're talking about these things in real terms, it's a lot to get your head around.
I mean, I've been quite open about the fact that I use I use AI in order to help come up with some of the questions for this. So I don't know this, the rise in the machine in its own right, but one of the things I liked was about will we have a universal basic income?
Yes.
You think that's a given?
100%.
How far off?
Not very.
Really?
Yeah. So the question isn't, whether or not we would have to have something like that. The question is how we do that. That it's equitable. It offers the right sort of all of the principles which went into a DE&I strategy, for instance.
Yep.
The things which founded those types of things, the thinking to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to get access to education, get access to opportunity, that kind of stuff, is treated fairly. All of the principles which went into the creation of DE&I, I mean, where it is now, there's a lot of negotiation happening and debate happening, especially over in the Americas, around its appropriateness in the workplace. And I think there's right to be certain challenges around a lot of that kind of thing. But the fundamentals of which went into the creation of that as something which we need to consider is still something we need to consider.
Right, okay. I suppose I'd never really linked it with the DEI strategies. That's a big... I mean, we're talking about Maslow's hierarchy, aren't we? That if the whole world has that financial base, does the human race move?
Well, straight away. I mean, if you think
stage?
about Maslow, great point. I mean, the question is, at what point?
Where's the starting point?
Yeah, where's the starting point?
Interesting.
Now if I don't have internet connection, I'm missing one of my it's rated the same as water or lighting in your house in terms of like
of course.
minimum standards, for housing, livelihood in the UK.
Where do you think that puts us then in terms of if we have a universal basic income, where does that pitch the job/work divide that you mentioned earlier? Do you think it becomes more likely that people will see things as work, less likely?
Again, I mean, the workplace is fundamentally changing. It's there's a fundamental shift. Again, it comes back down to moving away from jobs, moving into this sort of workspace, which is very much driven by purpose. And then considering the fact that technology is going to elevate our roles. A lot of people are going to be coming into work at a different level. So they won't be doing potentially the logistics of putting an event together, like I said earlier, the picking the strawberries, the groundwork, the manufacturing side of things, the logistics side of things, that's all going to be picked up by technology. So people are going to be entering the workplace at a different space. So if that's your starting position, all of a sudden it elevates your entire thinking around where it is that you're going to be adding value.
Of course. And
because we're not coming in at that, we don't really understand what that could look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we? So I think there's always going to be this evolution, isn't there? Of you elevate your thinking and then you build on that thinking. You elevate that and then you build on that, and so on and so forth. So whenever we talk about subjects, and you were asking me this now, I'm thinking about my 11-year-old daughter or my 5-year-old son, and I'm thinking, what are they going to be doing? What are their challenges going to be when they get to my age? Is it still going to be, I've got to pay off the mortgage, I've got to get the kids to school, I'm going to make sure I've got a car to get there and back. What are the priorities? What are the things we like? What are the holidays we're going to go on? Stuff like that. Are those things still going to be the same? I think they most probably will, because you are talking about, sort of hierarchy of needs. But I think the context that you're going to be worrying about those things is going to be very different. So there's a dramatic mindset shift. I think there's also this multi-generational workplace which is spoken about. I think there's something really interesting in that, where you've got up to as many as 5 generations currently in the workplace.
Five now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I think that in itself is really interesting. So I believe they call it like, what does new wealth look like, or wealth look like to this latest generation? It's not generational wealth like the boomers. You know what I mean? It's not, they don't measure it in the same way. You or my generation measure it differently as well.
Yep.
So how you equate success, or how you calculate success, is going to determine a lot of how it is you approach, you know, how you're going to go into the workplace. But I do think purpose is going to play a much bigger part in all of that decision-making process.
It's really interesting.
Much bigger part.
So in 2074, going back to our year we've picked, what does the role of a HR person look like at that point with all these changes in place? I get that's quite a big question. Give me a few seconds there to think about that one. What do you think it will be?
So I do think that it's going to be, fundamentally, it's going to be hyper strategic.
All right. Okay.
So let me try and think of a really good example. So let's take carbon, for instance, right? If as an organization, or this building, this facility which we're in at the moment, you could, I don't know, build in mechanical energy reduction solutions. So you can build in heat recovery, you can build in your LED lights, you can build in ceiling tiles which absorb heat up until over the temperature of 19, and then when a temperature drops below 19 it releases that heat. You know, so there's amazing things that you could do, but they're very costly. They're very expensive, both in terms of buying, purchasing, putting it into practice, implementing it, setting it up, coding it, you know, if it's like heat and light and all those other things. Or you could teach people to switch off their screens before they leave in the end of the evening. So that behavioral change part of it, so call it like the carbon psychology, the human carbon psychology, or switching the lights off, or not using a space, or not having to heat every room in the house simultaneously, you know, somebody actually physically being conscious of that. The cost benefit of the human psychology is far greater than any physical thing that you could implement. So I think your bang for your buck, if you're going to go after performance and operational performance of your organization on your human side of things, is far greater than your bang for your buck, which you can implement in terms of systems, technologies, and all those kinds of things. I'm not saying that they don't have a place. They do. They absolutely do. But what you're going to get in terms of value for money is far greater there, because it comes at a much lower cost. You know, a bit of training, it's that kind of stuff, you know. Rather than, modern terms, putting a IVR system in versus doing some training, you know.
Makes sense. So you're saying we talk about that kind of the dial between people and performance. You monitor, you know, we're saying working from home increases performance, but it might not increase what we do for our people, in order that we actually lose that performance over time in the longevity. So you're saying that over time, you think HR role is going to be more and more into the strategic people or dev side, away from any performance.
Because it's going to be so data. It's going to be so data rich. It's going to be so data heavy. So think about that hyper personalization, which I was talking about before. You know, you're going to have data points on every single employee in your business. So you're data rich. You're incredibly data rich. So then it becomes about, okay, how do we put the right people doing the right jobs, and you being able to do that to within an inch of its life kind of thing, because you've got access to so much behavioral analytics. So it's not going to be about gathering that data. It's not going to be about having that data, storing that data. It's going to be about interpreting that data and making strategic decisions off the back of it. That's where I see that HR sort of operation. And I think naturally you're going to find yourself in that place anyways. Technology is only going to be moving forward. You're going to have a lot more consolidation, I think, in terms of technology as well, for it to be focused on just really simply accessing the right data to be able to do that interpretation, to be able to offer that advice as to which direction you need to go. And again, because I think fundamentally you get incredible amount of value from being able to mobilize your your human resource within an organization, and you're going to be able to do that.
Do you think it's going to move to a lot of, I mean, you said about all the data points there. Do you think we're very much going to move to real-time or even predictive HR analytics? Because, I mean, people talk about predictive HR analytics at the moment, but it's not there, is it? I mean, we're not even at real-time yet, let's face it.
So it's incredible, the fact that we're talking about these things in these terms. And, you know, a few years ago, we had a mission earlier on Minority Report, you know.
Yeah.
So, but no, there's absolutely going to be sufficient data for you to suggest that somebody is going to A, B, C, D scenario. You know, it's very natural.
It amazed me when I typed into the AI about it, talking about flight risks of people leaving their jobs, and will AI be able to predict it before it happens?
So I mean, you don't need AI to do that.
True.
So we could do that already. But again, it comes back down to data. So I'll give you a really simple example. Worked with a team who focused on spaced repetition. They developed a product called Elephants Don't Forget. And what they were able to do, they worked with a neuroscientist, and what they were able to do through their testing is, with I think it's about 70-75% accuracy, indicate whether or not somebody, an individual in a call center, was most probably going to be leaving the organization within 6 months, with 70-something% accuracy. And all they did was, through their spaced repetition tool, which asked maybe 2 or 3 multiple choice questions a day, included in those questions a question around, have you had your one-to-one? Have you had your coaching session? You know, and it's all the questions were around engagement, and the ones which didn't have that right level of engagement were far more probable, far more likely to leave within 6 months.
Do people know the purpose of it? Did anyone work it out? How to get around it?
The questions. I think it's part of so. One thing with something like that is you've got to always consider the human aspect. So if you're going to implement something like that which asks multiple choice, people need to recognize that actually it's not an assessment tool.
Okay.
That it's a tool that you can trust.
Yep.
And they need to be able to trust it. You know, so if you're going to be implementing it into somewhere and somebody's going to be using it for traditional performance management, and I use it like as in the old school sort of way of talking about it, i.e., you know, trying to get you out kind of thing, then it's not ethical. It's not the right way to use the tool, and it needs to be removed from those people who are using it in that way, because you're eroding the trust in the tool. If the tool is there as a developmental opportunity, so that, you know, you can recognize individuals which are highly capable, maybe your talent, understand whether or not you've got capability in terms of knowledge in a particular area. It's fantastic. It's brilliant. It's amazing. So to answer your question, in order for that tool to be successful, you have to have developed trust. Sure. So if you've got trust in the tool, you negate the need to even think about whether or not people are going to try and circumvent the questions. If they trust it. So, and again, large part of the campaign in setting something like that up is you spend months ahead of time communicating that this isn't an assessment tool. This is about development. This is about improving and supporting you, and it needs to maintain that trust in that as a tool. So no, again, 70-something% in terms of accuracy, and I might be quoting wrong, and I'm sure Adrian, if he had heard this, will correct me very quickly, and he's welcome to as well.
We'll be sending it out.
So apologies if I've understated it. It's been a few years, but you know, in the absence of any data, all of a sudden you being able to access 74% accuracy in terms of data probability of flight risks, that's amazing.
Oh, absolutely.
That's amazing.
Absolutely.
So
I mean, what it leads into something quite nicely actually, which is this area of gamification. Anyway, will work in general become gamified? I mean, we spoke about that work job balance side of things.
Yeah.
Do you think as a whole we'll try to gamify work so it never becomes work?
I think gamification I mean, as a term, it's been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
And I think it implies something which it doesn't, which it shouldn't. So it implies, like, I don't know, sat behind a PS4 with an old controller kind of thing, and Xbox or whatever, and playing physical games. Whereas I think it's far better represented as an immersive experience. So VR, AR, all of that XR, experience reality type stuff. I do see that that's going to play a much bigger part in the future. There's certain limitations on, on what we've got available to us right now, which means that hasn't quite come to life. But I don't see it being very long before those limitations disappear. Yeah. And you can access a 1 gig wireless connection with a headset whilst you're walking around. Do you know what I mean? So there's physical limitations to making that and really bringing that to life. But yeah, I do think a lot of the future workplace will be part of that experience reality, that meta world.
Metaverse. Yeah, it's something that keeps coming up, the metaverse side of things, isn't it? I mean, I've been in virtual reality or augmented reality escape rooms, and I loved the idea of it for about 5 minutes, and then when I had a bout of motion sickness kick in, I struggled with it, and I remember thinking to myself, if I had to work like this for the entire day, I'd be constantly ill, struggling with the VR and AR headset. So it's always been a bit of a doubt.
You wouldn't be very good as a fisherman, would you?
No, absolutely not. So yeah, there's a reason I pick certain jobs that I have done. So it's always been a kind of a doubt to me in the back of my head. But I suppose I tried VR AR headsets 15 years ago when I worked at the university, but then they were a lot worse. And in fairness, they are becoming better, and the technology is becoming better. And there's been a big push by Facebook around it again recently, haven't they? They've given it a little nudge and tried to integrate it into kind of the television side of things as well. So I mean, the metaverse. Well, let's start with this question actually. What the heck is the metaverse? That is a good question.
Well, I think so. So metaverse, I mean, that's pretty accessible. You can go on, you can check it out, and it's it's an immersive space. You can have a conversation with people, or you can do activities and tasks. And I think if we elevate that up to experiential reality, and I might be using slightly older terms. I'm not sure what the standard term is, but if you're starting to talk about that space, VR is within that. Augmented reality is within that. Where you have your glasses and it tells you on Google Maps you've got to turn left on your glasses screen. It's that kind of stuff. I think part of that experiential reality could be, again, if I think about an insurance broker who's working on a farm and they have a augmented reality pair of glasses, and they look at a combine, for instance, and automatically they register that combine, that name, that logo, everything. Straight away, there's an evaluation which can take place in the background.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? So very simply, it makes it really simple for that insurance person to walk around the estate and just pinpoint. So by the time they finish their walk, they're able to give the farmer straight away a quote.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
That makes sense, yeah.
And there's no going back to the office and coming back in 3 days' time and all that kind of stuff. It's there and then. It's immediate. It's straight away. I mean, don't get me wrong. That comes with its challenges as well. Like, I mean, the fact that you're going to be sat on the farm with that level of information needing to be transferred between you need to have a good enough signal to be able to do that. So, but again, that's what we're talking about. So there's one really practical use case. Other really practical use cases we saw a few years ago, again in the energy side of things, smart meters being installed across the country. Government putting into play, you have to have a smart meter, and your energy supply has to supply you with one. So all of a sudden, there's a huge shortage in terms of talent and skills to be able to come in and do that switch out with smart meters. The apprenticeship programs went through the roof. The apprenticeship levy was, by those which are using it, was sucked dry entirely by just those installers for energy companies. And then you think, okay, how amazing would it be from a health and safety perspective that an installer can have glasses on which recognizes what meter they're currently working with, what the dangers associated to that, the process and the steps they have to go through to make sure that they consistently follow the right steps to maintain their safety in being able to swap out gas related equipment. So again, there's another really very useful today use case. So now you take that and you dial it up by about 500 if you're talking about 1970 2074, what am I saying, 1974, so 2074, you can kind of imagine straight away like the length or the access that you'll be able to have in terms of technology to do activity. You know, all of a sudden you're thinking about a completely different Bruce Willis film here, you know.
Yeah. So you're thinking it's not headsets and being in a virtual office, it's being out and about and interacting with the Google Glass style.
I think it's project. All of it.
Right,
I think it's going to be all of it.
Do you think we'll have a virtual office at any point?
Well, we have one now. So you can do an online conference where you can use your, you know, whether it be your Apple ones or your Facebook ones or whatever, where, you know, your headset on, you move through a space, a virtual space, and as you come closer to people, you start to overhear their conversations. And you can start to become part. You can participate in those conversations if you wanted to. So again, I think that's not a long way off. And yes, people going into a physical office, needing to be in a physical office, or a doctor or a surgeon sitting, but all of a sudden you'll be doing these things, and that's the one thing which we haven't spoken about. You'll be doing these things on a global scale.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, massively.
So when you talk about your talent pool isn't going to be the Midlands or London, or, you know, if you're based up in Leeds or the UK or Europe even. Yeah,
it's going to change quite drastically. And I suppose the human side, but again, the HR, where is that space going? The cross-border side, I think, is probably going to become bigger and bigger and bigger, I suppose.
Yeah, as it should. I mean, I think that's one thing which I'm really positive about, because we mentioned about social inequality, you know, a kid growing up in a favela in Brazil, or a shack or shanty town down in Soweto, or Hammanskraal, Khankua, or something like that, or a slum in India. You know, if you're on a global economy, all of a sudden they've got access to this marketplace.
Yeah,
I mean, the access to education is getting better. But you know, it's a race against the increasing population always. Absolutely. So I think we have to do more in terms of making sure that we give that access. And again, one of the things which you'll see ESG having a tough time, especially on the DE&I side of things in North America at the moment, is around actually it needs to be not about this person because they're that sex, ethnic, race, whatever, or you recruiting with that element of bias to get bias out, which is ironic in itself. I'm not saying that those are bad things. I'm saying that those things which, you know, a lot of the logic which went into designing the need for that kind of thing still stacks up, absolutely, because it's about social inequality and we need to eliminate that. But equally, does that then mean that the people which are best positioned get overlooked because they don't fit a particular mold? And isn't that exactly the same problem as you had before, which you're trying to solve with this policy? So again, that's the argument. That's not my argument, but that's the argument. I get the logic. It makes sense. So all of a sudden, you start to think, okay, well, the right person gets the job, but how can the right person get the job if your pool of right people wasn't accessible to this entire population?
Of course. That's really interesting. And I mean, I spoke to someone the other day about this kind of contrast that's going on with travel and work at the moment as well. And it boils down to this. We're going through an age where we're experiencing, obviously, the climate change problem. So we're trying to create more eco-friendly ways of travelling.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we're going to be travelling more in 50 years' time for work, having to travel across the globe because we've now developed eco-friendly systems, or we're all living in the metaverse and actually no one's travelling at all? Which way have you got any opinion on where it's going to sway? Which one?
Yeah, but I'm slightly biased though, because and the reason why I say that,
got a feeling where this is going.
Well, I'm slightly biased because, you know, the one thing which I do enjoy, whilst I can, is I do enjoy like taking the kids to school.
Yeah.
You know, walking the kids to school. So if I'm traveling to work, I go back into a space where perhaps I'm getting home and somebody in the household, or maybe even myself, have to give up on certain dreams and aspirations in order to, you know, look after the kids. And, you know, maybe I can't go for a particular role because it's just not accessible to me, because, you know, my priorities are like my family, my kids, you know, those kinds of things. So, so I think having access to this global marketplace will make things a lot more, give me a lot more freedom for somebody in my shoes.
Mm.
But then you've got to think as well, there is a very, very clear need for a distinct separation from work if your work is a job.
Sure.
So if your work is, I do a task, I come home, I earn my paycheck, and that's it, job's done, I'm happy. You don't want to be doing that where you're eating your dinner.
Yeah, of course.
Do you know what I mean? You want to have some degree of separation. So again, what we're talking about here is the mechanics which go into appropriate well-being. And what's appropriate for you might not necessarily be appropriate for me. For my needs are going to be slightly different to yours. Yep. Very different to somebody else who's sat outside, you know. So again, I think it's less about whether or not we will or will not. It's more about us being in a position where we can, if we need to.
Absolutely.
And we don't if we don't. So
yeah, absolutely. No, it's really interesting. I think there's that divide at the moment as well. And I think one of the things that will change is we may find that leisure travel goes up and work travel comes down.
Is that
work
what you
travel
think?
becomes a subset of it. Yeah, I've got a feeling it's going to sway in that direction. That work will become a subset of that. And your ability to travel will actually be, they'll be implicated and they'll have interactions from one to the other. I think that'll be interesting to see what happens.
I think I'd be interested to have a conversation with you about your data and what you see in your world, especially around the culture side of things, you know.
In terms of travel? Or
yeah. Because we've seen, haven't we? We've sort of seen, like, we went into lockdown, we saw everybody sort of moving home, and then all of us, oh, wow, look at the productivity, it's gone through. Mental health as well, you know, it's not been great. And then obviously we now see a lot of people going back into the office and the need to sort of galvanize people's identity around the brand of the organization, drive sort of a stronger sense of that identity as a part of a team, by having that engagement, you know, on a physical, you know, one-to-one basis. So again, we understand the logic. So yeah, I just don't know where it's going to land, put it that way. It still feels like it's still slightly up in flux.
Yeah, I mean, I like talking about this point a little bit, that it's only recently the UK government released a statement saying that working from home increased productivity. I think they were saying 13%.
Okay.
There's a bonus to working from home. On the same day, and this was on BBC News, the two articles were released together pretty much at the same time.
Okay.
On the same day, there was a BBC News article stating that Amazon had told everyone to come back into the office 5 days a week. And then the two articles were released pretty much side by side on the same day, and you just got to look at it and think, nobody really knows where this is going at the moment. Everyone's kind of on a journey together. And the point I always particularly try to talk about with people is we're coming to an age of personalization. We're coming to an age of data and understanding what's going on. And you don't get in a car and just follow what the other cars are doing in the hope that you'll turn up at your destination. You have to you're on your own journey, and every company is now so different. You know, we're not all based in factories anymore. We're not in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Every company is different, and everything's more personalized than it used to be. There's so many variables in a company now that there's no way you can just look at what another company's doing and copying it. So the primary thing companies need to be doing at the moment is listening to what their company needs. And that's not just from a point of view of what their people want to be able to do their jobs better, but it's also you're looking at what the travel needs are of the company, what the environmental impacts are. It's looking at what the HR laws around that, how they're going to change the right to disconnect, that's possibly coming into play in the UK. And so there's a few things to take into place there, but I don't think, and it's easy to make sweeping statements at the moment about every company is going to be doing, but I think the fact is, we used to make sweeping statements years ago about the human race in general, but we realised that people are very different, and I think there's going to be an evolving trend in companies, and we realise that you can't make those sweeping statements across companies because they're just so radically different, even from one company to the next in the same industry now. They're just entirely different in how they behave because there's so many variables at play, and we have to be more internally focused, business leaders do, at looking at what you need internally than looking at what other people are doing and trying to compare. And I think that's it. There's too much focus on benchmarking and not enough on what's needed for our people to do the job they need to do, and that balance between people and that balance of performance, and hence some of these podcasts and exploring those ideas and exploring what's needed within that.
Yeah, there was a great question which I saw. I think it's at Summit, which is happening tomorrow, I believe. And one of the workshops, the question which was being put forward was, is retention the new recruitment? Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because, retention of staff,
I think if you can get it's interesting, isn't it? We talk about sales, and you'd say, right, do you sell and then try to work on a brand afterwards? You don't. You work on your brand and then you have an ability to sell. Yet when it comes to recruitment, we completely miss that. You've got to get your internal employer brand right. So what is it your people need? What is it you're offering? What's that value proposition you're offering to them? What do they need?
Yeah.
And if you can get that bit right, then it's very easy to go out and find similar people, and much easier than it is doing it the opposite way around. You'd never just go out and randomly sell and then try and produce a brand afterwards.
Yeah. I can draw on a fair few comparisons just with that as a logic. How often I don't know if you found it, but especially with insurance companies or broadband or mobile phone, it's cheaper to go elsewhere than it is to stay and renew.
Yep.
Because there's better offers for new clients and not a lot for existing clients. So I can see that logic again. There's track and there's better opportunities and better offers. So somebody new coming into an organization might come in at a much higher salary because that's the market rate at that time.
Yeah.
Than somebody who'd been there, say, now 2, 3, 5, 20 years, and it's perhaps a bigger asset.
Yeah, absolutely. And it again flicks back to that point of looking at being more internally focused to try and solve that problem.
So employee value proposition is something which is very prominent in our world in particular at the moment. But the thing is, just having a well-being portal and having a benefits portal doesn't mean that you've got a strong employee value proposition.
Yeah.
This is,
it's a
again,
band-aid.
Yeah. I think what we're starting to touch on here is these aspects do point towards something which I've had a little bit of a personal gripe, is that I do think in terms of the HR space, that continuous professional development, that eagerness, that need for understanding what does not just good but great look like. I've never seen that hunger as you do say now in sales, or you do say now in operations, in HR. That hunger to always, what does the best HR functions do, and what are we not doing? I've always felt like the HR function is lagging in those terms. So then you go, am I being critical? Am I being too critical? Why is that the case? Why is that the sense that you get from this? And I suppose one of the elements is the protection, isn't it? And protection of not losing a culture by going out and doing dramatically different things. Not losing, say, 20, 30 years worth of IP as a result of changing the way you do things so fundamentally that the people which have been there for 20, 30 years decide, not for me, or I can't deal with this change. So again, you can kind of look at it in one say and say, okay, I think we need to change, but at the same time, how do you do that without losing, without it just costing you too much, if we recognize HR as being like the feelings of the organizations. I hate to use that word because it sounds really soft, and but the sense of identity which is being protected by HR, which implements its policies, which has a look at, which is responsible for all the people processes and things like that. They can fundamentally mess a company up if they don't do the right thing, especially around their policies. But that doesn't mean you can't push yourself further, I think. And even if you get to the point where you say, no, I'm choosing not to do this.
Sure.
And here's the logic, here's the reasons why, that's perfect. But where, you hear statements and quotes like, oh, I don't do tech, I don't do technology. That's something which I think is a bit difficult to swallow sometimes.
Yeah, when it's becoming sort of core part of what HR is going to be.
It's going to be the backbone, because they're talking about behavioral analytics. You're talking about, HR becoming elevated to a strategic role, driven by data. Yes.
Predictive.
So, this put it this way: those who adopt it are going to fly. Those who don't, won't. I think it's going to be like absolutely. Those. It's like the greatest mathematicians, or the mathematicians which did incredibly well once the calculator was invented, were the ones which adopted it and were able to do far more complex calculations as a result.
Of course, absolutely.
The ones which died were the ones who didn't. So, yeah.
No, that's amazing. Well, I mean, we're kind of coming to the end of the podcast now for this section. But as I mentioned earlier, I drew up some additional questions to what I like to do in my background research from AI, as it's a tech podcast I thought I'd do. And it drew up what I thought was one of the best questions I think I've seen come out of it yet. And I couldn't leave the podcast without ending on asking this question. Will HR need to manage interplanetary employee relations?
Oh, absolutely.
I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and everyone thought it would come out with that as a question.
Absolutely. There was actually a talk on this in London a few weeks ago. And interplanetary politics, because a lot of our laws are governed by geographies almost, but like political geographies, like countries and states and.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, the way Elon Musk is going, this is probably be there way before 2074 at this rate. So yeah.
Well, if all of those policies are based on legal precedent set on under this government or under that, if there isn't a government, it doesn't belong to anybody. I think it's therefore the precedence doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So
true.
100%.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Which 100%. Legal system does it come under? Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we struggle.
All of a sudden, you're in never time law, isn't it? You start to go into to that space.
We struggle with time changes, just moving between the US, Europe, and Asia, let alone a different day. So that'll be fascinating to see. But I felt like I couldn't end without asking that question to do it a favour.
I will send you some details of some of the guys which have spoken about that specifically.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
I'll make sure I share it in the links below.
Sure.
But anyway, that's wrapping up towards the end of the podcast. I think there's been some brilliant discussions again today. I think definitely for me, the big takeaways around that balance between what a job is and what work is, and that separation between the two, where that will move forwards, and tech just being so pivotal to where HR is going and how it underpins the push towards HR being the core of where companies are going to be in 50 years' time. And I think that's probably the critical takeaways. So thanks for coming in and discussing that today, Dee. So really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining. And thank you everyone again for listening to the podcast. Remember to subscribe if you'd like to listen to some more podcasts. Again, thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and see you all again soon.